On December 17, 2025, Nick Reiner appeared before a judge for the first time in a closed hearing. He did not stand before the public, did not face the cameras, and was almost entirely absent in words. When questioned, Nick offered only a brief reply. "Yes, Your Honor." No explanation, no reaction, no sign that this was a turning point in a life that had slipped off its familiar course. The hearing proceeded quickly, purely procedural in nature. There was no argument, no on-the-spot defense. The record listed 2 counts of first-degree murder, with an aggravating factor due to multiple victims. The defendant's name was read alongside an inescapable fact. He is the son of Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner. As the legal process began to move forward along its familiar track, the Reiner family chose to speak in a different way, not to explain the case, but to name the loss. In a rare joint statement, the remaining children of Rob and Michelle wrote, "The horrific and devastating loss of our parents, Rob and Michelle Reiner, is something that no one should ever experience." They emphasized that their parents were not merely figures in public life, but our best friends. The family did not mention the charges, nor did they name the defendant. Instead, they appealed for restraint. "We ask that speculation be tempered with compassion and humanity." A simple request, but set against the cold confines of the courtroom, it creates a stark paradox. The law demands absolute precision, while those left behind ask only to be treated with humanity. But before the court convened or any case file was opened, everything around them continued to function as usual. One day earlier, Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner were still alive. On the evening of December 13, 2025, they attended an end-of-year gathering at the home of Conan O'Brien, surrounded by familiar faces from the Los Angeles entertainment community. There was no ceremony, no focal point. Conversations unfolded in scattered pockets within a private space, following the natural rhythm of a social gathering. People arrived, talked, and then left. The evening passed in a way that no one felt the need to remember. Nick Reiner was also present. He was not on the guest list, but his parents asked that he be allowed to come along. During the party, he did not remain with any fixed group, instead moving between conversations. His presence created a sense of misalignment with the overall atmosphere. Nick was reportedly seen walking around the gathering, interrupting conversations, asking direct questions such as, "What's your name?" or "Are you famous?" At some point, a heated argument is said to have occurred between Nick and Rob. After that, Rob and Michelle left the party. Nick Reiner remained for a period of time before leaving as well. Those who were present continued with their evening, with no particular reason to mark or remember this sequence of events. After Rob and Michelle departed the gathering, no further incidents were recorded that night. The remainder of the evening passed without any reported signs of disturbance. What occurred after guests dispersed was not captured by witnesses or public surveillance systems. The period from the end of the party until the afternoon of the following day exists as a blank space in the timeline of the case. The house in the Brentwood neighborhood, where the 2 victims had lived for decades, is part of a quiet and secluded residential area of Los Angeles. It was a home they had occupied for many years, not a temporary or unfamiliar location. On the day after the party, there were no outward signs of anything unusual at the property until the sequence of events that led to the discovery of the 2 bodies began. On the afternoon of December 14, 2025, the chain of events began in the quietest way possible. A therapist who had been scheduled to visit Rob and Michelle Reiner at their Brentwood home was unable to gain entry. The door was closed. There was no response. After repeated unsuccessful attempts to make contact, the individual did the only thing possible in that situation: contacted the family to report the concern. At approximately 3:30 p.m., the adult daughter of Rob and Michelle Reiner received the call and went to the house to check. There is no information indicating that she had been warned of any imminent danger. Upon entering the home, she discovered her father's body. According to reports released later, she left the house almost immediately and called the police. At the moment she left, she did not yet know that her mother had also died within the same space. Los Angeles police and fire personnel were dispatched to the scene in the mid-afternoon. After a full inspection of the residence, they confirmed that both Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner were deceased. Initial observations quickly ruled out certain possibilities. There were no signs of forced entry, the home had not been ransacked, and there were no reports of missing property. The scene did not resemble a failed burglary or a random intrusion. Those details led authorities, from the earliest moments, not to treat the case as an ordinary crime. Investigators determined that the weapon used was a knife. However, at that stage, they did not disclose whether the knife had been recovered, nor did they confirm whether it had been brought in from outside or was already present in the home. The exact time of death for the two victims was also not released, pending forensic examination. These gaps left the picture incomplete, even though the outcome itself was already irreversible. Before the incident was formally named in investigative language, the Brentwood neighborhood continued to operate according to its familiar rhythm. There was no lockdown, no community alert, no indication that anything abnormal was unfolding behind the gates of a house that had stood there for more than 3 decades. What had happened, up to that point, belonged solely to the private sphere. Later, some neighbors reported that they had seen Nick Reiner moving around the area in the days prior. There were no descriptions of violent behavior, no loud noises. What was recalled was not an event, but a pattern of movement, coming and going multiple times, not staying in one place for long, appearing at irregular hours. At the time, these observations carried no particular significance. They resembled the ordinary movements of an adult living within a family property. No one recorded them. No one questioned them. There were no witnesses who could confirm seeing Nick enter the main house that night, nor was there independent data showing that he left the property at a specific time. Most of what was later mentioned emerged retrospectively, after the context had changed and earlier details were reorganized under a new framework. Only after the two bodies were discovered were those prior movements separated from the flow of normal life, not because the movements themselves had changed, but because the way they were viewed had changed. When police completed their initial processing of the scene, Nick Reiner was not present at the house. His absence was noted in the preliminary report. In discussions with law enforcement, the daughter of Rob and Michelle Reiner expressed the view that Nick was someone who should be considered based on pre-existing concerns about his behavior and condition. This was not a formal accusation, but it was sufficient for police to broaden their search later that same evening. Several hours later, Nick Reiner was located at a gas station near the University of Southern California campus, more than 10 miles from his parents' home. He was taken into custody by the LAPD with no reports of resistance or attempted flight. The arrest occurred less than 6 hours after the bodies of Rob and Michelle Reiner were discovered. According to information released afterward, in the period before his arrest, Nick Reiner was believed to have appeared at a hotel in Santa Monica around 4 a.m. on December 14th, 2025. The hotel is located not far from his parents' home. After Nick left, hotel staff reported discovering multiple unusual signs in the room, including blood in the bathroom and on other surfaces. A window had been covered with bed sheets. These details later became part of the data collected by investigators, though they were not fully disclosed immediately. After his arrest, Nick Reiner was transferred to the Los Angeles County Jail for temporary detention. There, he was required to undergo mandatory medical evaluation before he could appear before a judge. Official sources confirmed that Nick was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, with an aggravating factor due to multiple victims, and was accused of directly using a deadly weapon, a knife. From that point on, the case was no longer treated as a suspicious death within the family of a public figure. It formally entered the status of a criminal case. The relationships of father and son, husband and wife disappeared from the language used. In their place were legal terms: victims, defendant, weapon, aggravating circumstances. Actions taken before and after the victims' deaths began to be reorganized into a timeline in which every detail, no matter how small, could become evidence in court. When the initial facts were placed side by side, it became clear that the sequence of events did not end at the Brentwood house. At the scene, there were no signs of forced entry, no property taken, and no evidence of intrusion from outside. That very sense of enclosure compelled investigators to expand their focus to another location: the hotel in Santa Monica. Unlike a private residence, this was a space with staff, security cameras, transaction records, and logged times of entry and exit. The traces reported in the room where Nick Reiner stayed, blood in the bathroom, abnormal surface markings, windows covered with bed sheets, were not merely physical details. They triggered a series of mandatory procedures: extracting surveillance footage, determining check-in and departure times, reconstructing movement patterns. From that moment, the case began to generate data points beyond the control of any individual involved. Investigators were required to compare timelines, distances, and travel feasibility between locations. One of the earliest nodes in this movement map led to a gas station near the University of Southern California campus, a place that bore no signs of a crime scene, where daily life continued without disruption, without barricades or closures. The arrest there did not conclude the sequence of events. It marked the moment when the case exited the private sphere entirely and entered the public verification track of the justice system. From the time he was deprived of his freedom of movement, Nick Reiner was no longer recorded as an individual with isolated actions. His name became tied to reports, procedures, court schedules, and timelines independent of personal intent. All subsequent movement took place within controlled spaces, according to the operational rhythm of the legal system. His first appearance before a judge was not intended to address the substance of the case, but to establish the legal framework for the next phase. The hearing was brief, speech minimal. Procedural decisions entered into the record. It was the moment when the judicial process formally began, separating the case from all external interpretations. Once the initial procedures were completed, the case entered the pre-trial phase, where information no longer moves according to events, but according to filings. The 2 counts of first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances were formally established, but the core of the evidence had not yet appeared before the public. From this point on, what was disclosed was only the legal framework. The true weight of the case lay in what remained unsaid. The case therefore exists in a suspended state between what has been confirmed and what is still under review. It does not end with an image or a moment, but with a pause in information. The facts currently available are sufficient to define a legal direction, but not enough to produce a complete explanation. All further developments no longer belong to the realm of narrative, but to the justice system, where conclusions, if any, emerge only when the undisclosed material is presented before a court of law. At that point, Nick Reiner existed only on paper. A name on an indictment, an identity summoned before the law, a sequence of actions measured in time and distance. The justice system did not need to know how that person had come into being. It needed only to determine where he was, when he was there, and what could be proven. But before becoming a defendant in a first-degree murder case, Nick Reiner had lived for a long time in a different world. Not the world of law, but of family life, where fractures are not entered into records, but accumulate quietly over many years. To understand why his name appears in the file in this way, it is necessary to go back far before the courtroom, before the indictment, back to where Nick Reiner grew up in the shadow of a family whose fame existed before him, but did not point out a clear place for him to stand. Nick Reiner was born in 1993, the second child in the family. He grew up between siblings, within a family structure where success was already a given before he was capable of making choices of his own. Fame. There was not a destination, but a fixed backdrop, something that surrounded his childhood without providing a ready-made role to step into. In his early years, Nick was described as a highly energetic child. A rare appearance alongside his father in front of the press when he was very young showed him unable to sit still, moving continuously around the table as if incapable of sustaining prolonged stillness. At the time, this was regarded as temperament, not a warning sign. Later, however, Nick himself said that his relationship with his father was not truly close during those formative years. The physical presence was there, but the emotional connection was thin. According to people who worked within the household, Nick was not only restless, but often entered shared spaces in an agitated state, disrupting the existing order. Bursting into rehearsal rooms, shouting during otherwise quiet moments, these episodes were not directed at any specific person, but they were enough for adults to recognize that the child could not regulate his responses to the situation around him. The family sought therapy fairly early on, an effort to keep Nick within a safe orbit, rather than to address a single incident. At this stage, recognizing that a problem existed did not mean that any external system had grounds to intervene. The unstable behaviors, though repetitive, remained within a range that the family could, and was expected to, handle on its own. There was no clear boundary between concerning behavior and conduct sufficient to trigger compulsory legal mechanisms. The family knew. Specialists knew. But the system acts only when a very specific threshold is crossed, when risk is no longer hypothetical. Before that point, all intervention remains preventative, not coercive. It is precisely this gap that allows many issues to exist in suspension, identified, but not forced to stop. As Nick entered adolescence, the misalignment no longer remained at the level of social disruption. He began using drugs at a very young age and quickly fell into a cycle of treatment, relapse, and disappearance. This was not a brief phase or a single misstep. Over many years, Nick moved in and out of rehabilitation facilities repeatedly, with the number of treatment attempts, by his own admission, exceeding 10. Alongside this were periods of housing instability, drifting across states, sleeping on the streets, separating himself from the familiar family structure, and then returning in a more depleted condition. Loss of control did not occur only outside the home. During periods of heavy substance use, Nick acknowledged destroying property within the family space itself, smashing electronic devices, damaging household items. At one treatment facility, he once threw a rock and shattered a window when he could not regulate his reaction. These incidents did not lead to criminal intervention. They continued to be handled within frameworks of protection and treatment, a pattern repeated throughout Nick's adulthood. Over time, these incidents were no longer seen as isolated events. They formed a familiar pattern: detection, soft intervention, temporary stabilization, then relapse. Each cycle ended before crossing a criminal threshold, and therefore left no clear legal trace. Within that pattern, the priority was not accountability, but keeping everything from exceeding the limits of control. This approach, though rooted in protection, inadvertently prolonged an unresolved state. one without a moment strong enough to force everything to stop entirely. When speaking about this period, Nick does not evade responsibility for what he caused. He describes himself as someone without an inner anchor, unable to understand who he was or how to exist in the world outside addiction. In public conversations, Nick repeatedly referred to the pressure of his family's fame, not as an advantage, but as a shadow that prevented him from forming a distinct identity. Rather than building a constructive role, he chose opposition, rebellion, anger, and self-destruction as the only way he knew to feel different. For Rob and Michelle Reiner, this was a prolonged period of helplessness. They sought specialists, treatment programs, and placed their trust in professional assessments while watching their son continually slip beyond their reach. Later, Rob acknowledged that his reliance on expert systems had caused him to miss signals that needed to be heard directly from his son, a realization that came only when the need for repair had become urgent. In 2015, signs of relative stability appeared for the first time. Nick co-wrote a film drawn directly from his experiences with addiction and father-son conflict. The project was not merely professional, it became a rare space in which Nick and Rob were forced to confront each other directly, without therapy or intermediaries. Rob referred to the process as therapy with my son, and many saw it as the closest the two ever came. The stability achieved during this period was not viewed as a destination, but as a condition requiring constant maintenance. In the context of long-term addiction, recovery does not mean closing the past. It merely slows old impulses temporarily. No one in the family called this an ending. Positive signs were acknowledged, but always accompanied by caution. What had happened did not disappear. It was simply kept at a safe distance, contingent on the balance not being disturbed. This caution imbued the calm with a paradox. The more stable things seemed, the more acutely the family recognized how fragile that stability was. The closeness reached during this period was therefore not named as a conclusion, but held as conditional recovery, where every equilibrium was understood to be temporary. There was no single decisive moment. Everything accumulated over years. Through repeated misalignments, the family had grown accustomed to absorbing. When the name Alan Jackson appeared in the defense file, the case entered a different phase. Not because a new explanation had emerged, but because this was an attorney known for handling cases where the question of who did it is no longer central. In this case, the victims had already been identified. From the outset, the core axis of the matter did not lie in identifying a perpetrator. Jackson's presence signaled that the defense was forced into a narrow corridor. This was not a case that could pivot on procedural error or technical detail. Any strategy had to confront the high thresholds of California criminal law. One such avenue was mental capacity at the time of the killings, a door that exists in theory but rarely opens in practice. The legal standard does not ask whether a person is disordered, but whether they understood what they were doing and could distinguish right from wrong. Information about prior arguments, if confirmed, becomes an obstacle to that very defense. Argument implies recognition. Recognition implies awareness of the interlocutor. In legal terms, that is not total incapacity. Nick Reiner's past, addiction, homelessness, repeated treatment, does not disappear from the record. It exists as background data mined by the press and debated by the public, but it does not automatically shield him from criminal responsibility. Substance use, if present, is not a direct defense. The law does not allow voluntary intoxication to become grounds for exemption. Here, the defense is left with only a narrow space to operate: degree, not denial of the act, but weakening the element of premeditation. Arguments, elapsed time, how the weapon appeared, all are weighed to determine whether the act was impulsive or prepared. This is where every small detail can become decisive weight. Self-defense is scarcely raised as a serious possibility. Differences in age, physicality, and the nature of the relationship make such an argument difficult to sustain. Manslaughter in the heat of passion also confronts the problem of time. The gap between words and action can turn against the argument itself. If any legal success exists, it lies only in reducing the charge, not eliminating responsibility. Even before trial, the case already bears the hallmarks of a prolonged proceeding, not only because of its violence, but because of the victim's prominence. Rob Reiner is not merely a victim in a criminal file. He is one of the rare Hollywood figures to move from mass television into cinema without losing central relevance. From Michael "Meathead" Stivic in All in the Family to films embedded in collective memory such as The Princess Bride, When Harry Met Sally, and A Few Good Men. Carl Reiner, his father, was another iconic figure in American comedy, placing this family long within the public sphere. As a result, when Rob Reiner became the victim of a criminal case, the file could no longer operate in neutral space. Legally, fame creates no exception. Standards of proof, burdens of argument, and sentencing frameworks remain unchanged. But the presence of a familiar name ensures that each detail is read not only as data, but against pre-existing perceptions. In that space, the prosecution must prove its case without appearing to exploit public sentiment, while the defense must argue within a context where assumptions have already formed. The law does not change, but the backdrop is no longer empty, and that alone makes every decision heavier than usual. At that time, many questions remained unanswered. Where the weapon came from, what security systems recorded, and how movements during the night unfolded in sequence. As the case entered the legal track, those details had not yet been named, but nothing was permitted to exist as a peripheral detail anymore. And while the file continued to move forward, the people who had created memories for millions of viewers came to a permanent stop. Once the justice system took control of the case, the public space closed. External reactions settled into memorials, while the core of the file was placed in preservation. The silence did not reflect a lack of information, but a regime of strict control, where what remains undisclosed is precisely what is being held for litigation. Jane Fonda wrote that they were caring, intelligent, and generous people who always sought to make the world kinder, noting that she had seen them only the night before in good health. Paul McCartney referred to Rob as someone who carried forward the Reiner family's creative legacy, leaving behind many joyful memories and laughter. Stephen King called them friends and allies, recognizing Rob as an outstanding filmmaker. These farewells do not form a unified explanation of death. They exist as fragments of memory, while the event itself remains beyond the public's capacity to interpret.